Hi, you are watching or perhaps listening to Political Dharma with Alan Zundell. In this particular episode of my show, I want to tackle the question of how our politicians are going to be handling the economy as we move towards the future. I'm going to identify 4 potential pathways that involve different understandings of how the economy works and different policy ideas for that we should be instituting that have been widely discussed in national politics and represented in presidential campaigns over the last decade or so. Those 4 pathways are the Make America Great Again movement under Donald Trump, with his particular understanding of how to manage our economy, and then so-called Bidenomics. Joe Biden claimed this for the approach that he took in his presidency. Underneath Biden on your screen is Bernie Sanders there representing Progressivism, which has formed a tentative alliance with the Bidenomics supporters. And on the left of Bernie, we have there Nikki Haley, who in the Republican primary in the last election represented a position I'm calling business conservatism. It was the approach taken by Republicans and conservatives for many, many, many years or even decades, and still exists among both Republicans and Democrats. I think Nikki is probably the most prominent of the exponents of this, at least in recent years. So I'm going to be talking about those 4, describing them in a little bit more detail, and then assessing each of them at the end of the show in terms of my predictions about their prospects for actually fixing economic problems or for attracting enough political support to be instituted. In order to talk about where we're going, I have to talk about where we've been and how we got here, and then identify what I think are the principal dynamics driving our politics in regard to the economy. In order to do that, I'm going to cover some American history pretty quickly, actually. And part of what I'm doing is illustrating these dynamics at work across American history. And part of what I'm doing is identifying periods of relative stability in the economic paradigm that's been adopted politically. By that, I mean that most national politicians espouse this particular way of thinking about and approaching economic issues. And it's so widespread, it dominates political discourse. So elections revolve around other things, such as which candidate can better manage the economy, given the same understanding of how we should approaching it, or personalities or side issues, cultural issues, other things like that. But the economy is always in the forefront of people's minds, whether it's performing well or badly from their standpoint in the economy. So I have to look back at American history. I'm going to do this very simplified form. And in the process of doing that, I cover so much ground, it's possible that I will get a few details here and there wrong. So if I do, I rely on all you to correct me. I'm drawing a lot on my memory of having studied this stuff over many decades, at least a few decades. And, I did some fact checking on some of it, probably it wasn't possible to do it on all of it. So let's get into some of this history. What I see is the principal dynamics put in very simple language here, affecting our politics and the economy. The economy, we have to remember, of course, we have a capitalist economy, and that means primarily that decisions about where to invest resources, buildings and lands and machinery, and hire workers, what kind of business enterprises, what kind of activities they will be devoted to, is in the hands of not the government, but private actors by their investment decisions. So, of course, the very wealthy are the people who are making most of these decisions. And what they're looking for is a profit. They are less focused on the social impacts of their economic decisions because they see it as their role just to make their company prosper or their stock values go up. So capitalism is a continual pursuit of profit. and competition with other firms or attempts to suppress competition in order to maintain profits. So that continual seeking of profits drives our economy. In politics, over the course of American history, there has been a struggle between wealthy elites who want to manage the economy in their interest and popular discontent looking for more say over what the government is doing. So there's a continual struggle, I would say, between oligarchic, that is, rule of the few, the wealthy few, and democratic strands of the American tradition, continual back and forth over that, particularly over questions of outcomes in the economy. So let's look at American history here and see how this plays out. England started to colonize the east coast of the North American continent in 1607. And this was a time when England itself was in a transitional phase between a feudal economy and a commercial capitalist economy. A feudal economy, to simplify it, is one based on land, and the agricultural workers are attached to particular pieces of land, and those who own or have trust over a piece of land. You may have peasants and landlords, or you may have farm owners and indentured servants, or you may have in the American South slaves and plantation owners. So these are very similar in the sense that it's very land-based and agricultural based, and wealth comes from owning that land and other people working it. Of course, in feudal society, there was various ranks and orders. People were not regarded as equal. There were people who were aristocrats and landowners and gentry, and then there were just common laborers, and then at the bottom of the heap, peasants or paupers. So there were different ranks. People weren't regarded as equal. England was expanding more and more, as other countries were, to extend trade with other countries and to gain resources at the expense of other countries. So they were looking for land to exploit. Of course, England is on an island and they run out of agricultural land and timber and things like that. So these colonists were there for the benefit of England. They were to grow crops and gather furs and ship them over there to England. The economic policy was set by England, by the government there. So it was very much government dominated. And the idea was what they call mercantilism. The nation of England was supposed to benefit from these colonists and their activities there. It wasn't just for the advantage of colonists as a separate group of people. But over time and generations, the colonists started to think of themselves as a separate people and not having the high ranks of some of the aristocrats in England. They saw themselves as a little more close to each other in rank, and they began to get rid of feudal type restrictions and had different economic interests emerge and decided they wanted to control their own economic destiny. Some of the conflicts were over the ability to trade with other nations. England wanted to have favorable status in trading with the colonists, whereas the colonists wanted to be able to get the best deal where they could. There was conflict over gaining new land to the west because the colonists each wanted to have their own farm and their own land. That was the source of wealth. A lot of speculators buying up land to the west, but England was concerned that that would provoke more conflict with the natives, and so they'd have to pay for military there, and they didn't have the means to do that and conduct a war with France at the same time. So there's a lot of conflict over economic policy, and the colonists decided that they wanted to have their own control over it. Oh, the American Revolution. Now, the elites there in the North and South, in the north of the colonies, they were mostly these shipping and commercial interests. They would bring in resources from the land and then ship them abroad to wherever they could. So a lot of investment in shipping. And in the South, they had the plantations with the slaves. So there was the elites on both sides, wealthy people on both sides, with different types of economies, really, in the North and South. But they both agreed that they wanted to be freed of British control. And they rallied the people to this by espousing these ideas that the power in government did not come from God to the king to the people. Rather, it came from the people up to the government. So the government would be representing the people at large. That's where the source of their authority was. Very different political conception. And it gave people new ideas about who they were and started this pressure for more democratic rights within the American political system. There is agitation for ordinary people to have the right to vote and not limited to just those who had a certain amount of wealth or paid a certain level of taxes, but ordinary people as well. So these ideas of democracy and equality start to conflict with the agendas of the elites. But the American Constitution was ratified in order to put a check on those kind of democratic developments. I won't go into that in detail, but that was the main purpose of it, is to ensure that things did not get out of hand. It was an agreement between the northern and southern elites, and this bargain between them held up for a while. In the period coming out of that, both of them wanted to develop their own economies and continue to make profits. But the interests of the North and South started to diverge. So there's a conflict here in the overall understanding of the role of the national government in the economy. In the South, they wanted to be able to sell things freely overseas, whereas in the North, they wanted to put tariffs up to keep out imports and have South send its cotton and other natural resources up to the Northeast, where they could turn them into clothes or other things, rather than sending them to England and then having them manufacture the clothes and send them back. So the Northeast was developing more in a manufacturing direction, using the profits from commercial trading to invest in small-scale manufacturing, which was growing over time. They also wanted more land open up to free farming, whereas in the South, they were concerned that if slavery was not adopted by new states, that they would lose their influence over the national government. There was also conflict regarding what taxes were used for. Taxes were mostly coming out of tariffs on imports and exports. And the northern eastern elites wanted to invest this in things that would facilitate commerce, such as infrastructure, canals, roads, and eventually the railroad network. So the interests in the North and South diverged, and there was conflict over government policy, especially over whether states would be free labor states or slave states. And this resulted in the Civil War, the defeat of the South, the decimation of the Southern economy with the freedom of the slaves, who were then given the right to vote by an amendment to the U.S. Constitution so again, extension of democracy. And the Northeastern elites had a free rein now to control the economy, and their ideology was prevailing. So the paradigm here was development of the economy through the expansion of land to the west and manufacturing in the Northeast, and using resources from the South to feed the factories in the Northeast. There was conflict developing, though, between farmers who felt at the mercy of the railroads and the commercial interests, and laboring people who were working in the factories. So we had new kinds of democratic pressures. Farmers and laborers started to create their own political parties and challenge those that were controlled by elites, business elites. They also were forming unions and granges and trying to combine forces. So this is a period in which it was dominated by commercial interests, but there were democratic pressures from below to open it up to have more opportunities or better conditions, better financial conditions for ordinary people. And it led to a number of reforms in the Progressive era, just after the turn of the centuries, where the right to vote was extended again to women, and there were direct election of senators and initiatives and recall of politicians, so more control over the political process on the part of ordinary people. Let's then move to the next phase. All right, so as commercial capitalism and corporate capitalism, new development was corporations in this new industrial economy based on things like railroads, steel, large-scale manufacturing. They needed more and more resources to order to maintain profit levels. So just like European nations, we were starting to extend our influence abroad once we had pretty much extended our control over the entire North American continent. There was efforts to build up a navy and have more influence abroad. We defeated Spain in a war and took control of Cuba and Puerto Rico and other places in the Caribbean. We went over and drove the Spanish out of the Philippines and took that over as a colony. We tried to gain influence within Japan. So there was expansion and competition on the part of these European economies that were growing, not only England, but now France and Spain as well. So competition over resources in other parts of the world led to the First World War between Germany and England in particular, and other nations joining in on various sides. The United States intervened in the war, and then the aftermath of the war, there was more of a movement towards protectionism of the U.S. economy to stay out of foreign affairs. So they raised tariffs, they blocked immigration, they decided to focus on developing our own economy, and problems were starting to develop anyway, which led to the stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression following that. One of the big pressures here was that the stock market was overvalued because people were looking for profits and the businesses weren't finding them, but the way to make money then was to gamble and speculate in the stock market. They used to speculate in land, now they speculated in shares of ownership of companies, and it became overvalued, and eventually the whole thing collapsed, leading to the Great Depression. Of course, coming out of the Great Depression, there was a lot of popular discontent that led to a change in the composition of the Democratic Party. Franklin Roosevelt became president and instituted a number of reforms, regulating finance, creating programs that were supposed to help and protect ordinary people, like Social Security and unemployment insurance, giving more advantages to unions, making it easier for them to organize. But what really changed this was the entry into World War II. Without getting into the causes of that too much, the United States entered, and what it did is it expended lots of government money on things like infrastructure and research. By infrastructure, I mean building factories. The government paid for building factories so that they could provide planes and jeeps and tanks and provisions for troops. And they also did research in things that would help in the war effort, like how to turn oil into plastics, how to have jet planes rather than propeller planes, radar, even early computer systems. So a number of areas where the government was expanding manufacturing and investing in research that led to new products after the war. After the war, of course, Europe and Japan had been fallen to their knees. They were bombed. They lost a lot of people. They lost a lot of their manufacturing facilities and transportation facilities because of bombs and fire and armies marching through. So they were not such a competition in the United States. The United States was relatively untouched by the war, other than expanding its economic influence. So then now we had the world to ourselves and could take advantage of that situation. And it was a prosperous time for American business, and they were able to share some of that with labor to bring labor peace. So there's this kind of agreement between government, labor, and business to keep things on an even keel during this period. They not only maintained New Deal programs, but they maintained the idea that you needed to keep spending to keep the government, to keep the economy moving forward. For example, Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican president during the 1950s, invested in the public freeway system so that it would be easier to move commercial goods around the country from one place to another, trucks carrying things around on this new freeway system. So the United States continued to invest, and the business could afford to give better deals to labor, especially the bigger companies, and then to continue to maintain profits. So this was a good period of time, and one that people often look back on as, why can't we go back to that? What went wrong? And something did go wrong. In the 1970s, this is a period I lived through as a young adult. We had inflation out of control, much worse than we've had lately. This was in part because of the oil-producing nations producing an alliance, coming into agreement with each other to raise oil prices to their benefit. And when you increase the price of oil, you increase the price of everything else, because most factories burn oil to run, or energy is produced by oil. and oil is turned into plastics for various products, and it's used for shipping things and trucking things. So oil increases inflation and everything else. It was also caused in part by spending on the military. In the Cold War, we spent lots of money on the military. This was not producing any kind of consumer products, but it was using resources to produce stuff. And the Vietnam War was quite expensive, but didn't bring us any value at all, even in terms of new markets or resources or much of anything like that. So there was inflation at the same time as recession because businesses were not doing as well as they used to. And another big part of this is that now Europe had recovered, so we had greater competition. Think cars and German and Japanese imports of cars. So the car companies were now having big competitors, and it meant their profit margins were being squeezed, especially as they had these labor contracts providing benefits and high wages. So now they turned towards a movement to undo these New Deal and other types of policies that had been the dominant paradigm for a couple of decades and find a different path forward. This is the transition to what is called neoliberalism. There was also movements of factories looking for ways to get greater profits by reducing labor costs. So you move factories from the north down into the south where they could have less unionization and lower wages, and then eventually moving them abroad where you can get even cheaper labor from other countries. So what is neoliberalism all about? This period stretching roughly from 1980 to 2008 or so. And the idea here was to facilitate capitalism expansion by reducing the role of government in the economy. This is the theory that won out among others. The 1970s were a time about a lot of economic turmoil and conflict in politics. And the position that won out, even at the end of Jimmy Carter's administration, at the end of the 1970s, going into 1980, was one in which these kind of neoliberal principles were adopted. He turned towards conservative economists for ideas and started instituting these. And then Ronald Reagan was the Republican winner in 1980 against Jimmy Carter, and he instituted these full force. So you see his picture there as he is the main Republican exponent of this, representative of this position. So reducing the role in government meant cutting taxes, which would allow business to have more money to invest, reducing government spending in some areas, so it could be so you could have these reduced taxes, and it was not in the military realm, it was more in the realm of social benefits, such as welfare programs or food stamps or anything like that, and reducing regulations on business, unleashing the financial sector, and less regulation on airlines and trucking, other areas. Again, that started under Jimmy Carter as well and was escalated under Ronald Reagan. Reducing regulations to reduce costs to business so they could have greater profit margins, reducing wage pressures. By that, I mean they wanted to bring wages down, so there was anti-unionization in part of this package, not as much support for labor unions. They were under the gun because of the movement of factories to other places, and so they made a lot of concessions during this period. Also, the way the Federal Reserve used the banking system to fight inflation at the expense of jobs meant that wages were also going to be reduced. And this is something that's continuing into the present day. Privatization of public institutions in a number of ways. This is when you saw a movement from public education at the secondary and primary level to more charter schools and vouchers to go to private schools. And you also had efforts to privatize Social Security by making it individual investment accounts and Wall Street firms rather than the kind of program that we've had where the new generation of workers pays in and the older generation has benefits when they get older. Also efforts to privatize the post office and the longtime Democratic Party's goal of public health insurance from the time of Franklin Roosevelt through to Lyndon Johnson, who instituted Medicare and Medicaid, to Bill Clinton, was one in which the shift was from public provision of health insurance to a privatized system. Now, Bill Clinton was the first Democrat to break this winning streak of Republican presidents, Ronald Reagan 2 terms, and then George H.W. Bush. And Clinton did it by moving towards this neoliberalism paradigm. And he, for example, instead of pursuing public health insurance as Democrats had, or at least the faction of the Democrats had for a long time, he decided to try to create a system. He and Hillary, his wife, tried to create a system in which there were government incentives for private insurance to expand and to cover everybody, so universal coverage. So it was really incorporating the private sector into areas that had traditionally been seen as something you might want to have in the hands of the public sector. Finally, international trade deals. The idea was that global capitalism had to expand beyond national boundaries, and the way to do that was to have free trade between all these nations, and each nation could benefit from specializing in whatever it was good at. Republicans just felt that the American businesses would prevail in some way, or at least as multinational corporations that could go wherever was to the best advantage of them. Democrats had this idea that if you trained workers, you could spread the wealth to them. If we had a more educated workforce, we could have an advantage of over other nations by bringing more technical and engineering type work here. So they wanted to invest in training and education and things like that. And of course, there were a lot of workers losing industrial jobs who didn't want to be trained, as the cliche goes, to be computer engineers. So this was a period of neoliberalism. Of course, in 2008, you had a crash when the real estate market crashed and nearly brought down the banking system worldwide. So this was a big crisis point, and it threw in question this neoliberal paradigm which both parties had adopted. So after this period of a couple of decades in which there was a widespread agreement within the government over the general approach to economics, there was now a lot of doubt about that and are looking for something different. Ordinary people felt like inequality between them and the wealthy was getting larger and larger. They were suffering, they were losing good jobs. Meanwhile, millionaires were turning into billionaires, and we had this near crash. We saw the government be able to bail out the big banks, but didn't do as much to bail out ordinary homeowners. So a lot of discontent over that. And then Barack Obama became the president. Let me move back to myself here. Very animated face again. Right, there I am. Okay. So Obama was a kind of transitional figure between the previous neoliberal era and looking for a new path forward. For example, he kept the emphasis on free trade. The big one was signed under Clinton, but started under the Republican administrations, was NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And we saw some discontent already in the 1990s when Ross Perot came out against free trade, said it was killing jobs. But after Ross Perot did that, there was this anti-democratic movement to make it harder and harder for independent candidates or minor parties to get on the ballot. So we had a movement away from democracy during that era. And as Obama took office, he extended free trade from this North American Free Trade Agreement to negotiating with other countries as well. You had the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I'm not sure if that ever got signed. Don't remember that detail. But again, he adopted the free trade approach, but he also went back to some ideas about industrial policy from the 1950s that is investing in different types of things like roads and bridges and the rest. So he passed a stimulus package to kind of get the economy moving again after it had come to a standstill after the crash of 2008 and 2009. Stimulus package mostly for businesses to keep people on board, like in the pandemic. A little bit of relief for ordinary people, a lot of relief for business, bailing out of the bank companies, and people thought they were the villains in this case, and yet they're bailing out the banks and also bailing out car company. One of the big ones, I think, was Ford. So people saw that they were bailing out some of these big businesses, that capitalism hadn't been working so well. They caused this big economic issue, and now the government was taking them out of that, but people were still having a hard time, ordinary people still having a hard time. And in the meantime, so Obama was investing in infrastructure, trying to create new jobs. He had these relief packages, stimulus package that was supposed to help ordinary people. And what else do I want to say about Obama here? Looking for my notes. And that was the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which gave relief to business and some people and also invested in things. Also, some limited reforms of the financial system after it had been deregulated Under Clinton and Reagan, it was re-regulated now to a limited extent as it had been in the 1930s, trying to go back to some of that New Deal regulation of finance. And he also wanted to expand healthcare, and he succeeded in ways that Clinton did with this kind of half and half system of government subsidies, but private insurers. So he's kind of half and half between neoliberalism and going back to older ways of doing things, trying to find the right mix of stuff. And then Hillary Clinton was going to carry forward this program, the kind of Clinton Obama way of approaching the economy. But Donald Trump prevailed in the Electoral College, and he had a whole different approach to this. And this is where we come into these four different potential pathways forward. I don't think this election that just passed settled things in any sense of the word. It will be Donald Trump making the decisions over the next 4 years at least, but there will still be a lot of agitation from other parties trying to promote these other types of approaches to the economy. So we have a period here of crisis and transition where it's not clear which is going to be the path forward. But the four that I mentioned earlier, I'm going to go back to now with a little more detail. First one being MAGA, Make America Great Again. And I call this economic nationalism because the mindset here that Donald Trump seems to have is that the United States is like a company that he manages. It's not something where in international cooperation or free trade, all parties can advantage. He says that, the United States is like a company, so it has to be interested in its own welfare. He's the CEO. He wants our profits to rise. He doesn't care about our competitors. So if you're another nation, he wants to renegotiate those trade deals with better terms for the United States. He wants to raise tariffs to keep out any imports that he thinks have an unfair advantage or are hurting American businesses. He wants to kick immigrants out of the country because they are not Americans. He wants jobs to go to them. So all this mentality here is about protecting American economic interests. And finally, his idea, I say personal transactions. His view of this is that like a CEO of a company or like a real estate wheeler dealer that he is bargaining for advantage in contracts with different people. He's willing to bargain with other nations, other leaders. He's willing to talk to people that other parts of the government are skeptical about, like Vladimir Putin or anyone else, really. He just sees it as this, he's the wheeler dealer here, and he is going to do everything he can to give the advantage to this nation. Now, this has been tried before, this kind of approach in the 1920s, as I said, the restriction of immigration, the raising of tariffs to try to protect American interests in an international economy does not address growing economic interests of global corporations who have business in all parts of the world. How do you separate American interests from other interests when you have companies owned by people from around the world or businesses merging from different countries? So I don't think this is going to work out too well. I think politically it may remain popular while people have some faith and hope in this new direction, but soon it's going to become apparent that it's not producing the results they expected. And I think folks are still willing to look around and see if there's something else better out there. J.D. Vance is in a position to be the leading Republican candidate in 2028, and he will carry forward this Trump agenda, but he has his own ideas as well. And of course, he's not the kind of wheeler dealer that Trump is. So I'm not sure how well he can pull this off. He may be inheriting a big mess from this, but I think he is the most likely standard bearer for this cause. The other approach here is Bidenomics. Now, this comes out of what Obama started with investing in what they regarded as businesses of the future. They didn't explain it very well, and they didn't provide a story for people to understand it, and the benefits were not coming right away. So I think it was a political loser, but I think in the long run, it would work better than what Donald Trump was offering. Here, Biden, he passed his Infrastructure and Investment Act and his Inflation Reduction Act and a few other things that had to do with investing in clean energy, for one thing, also investing in traditional infrastructure like roads and bridges and ports and airports. So all these things that are going to advantage the United States economy by subsidizing them through the government, not so much government spending, but government subsidies for private investment. So very clearly a compromise between neoliberalism and the older forms of investing using public funds. and in line with what Obama was doing. And computer chips, trying to bring us more in the forefront of computer developments. Also, a little more support for labor unions to put give them a peace branch saying, let's get on with this program because this is going to help you. We'll make sure that these new jobs are union jobs, and we'll give you some support. The National Labor Relations Board appointments that he made were very much more favorable to unions than they had been during the neoliberal era. So I think this has some promise in advancing American economic interests over the longer term, but I also think it doesn't address the economic competition that we're going to face. Any industry that we get an advantage of, we're going to lose that advantage eventually as other countries catch up, and then it'll be the same thing all over again. You got to find new ways of making profits. It's been the cycle of capitalism all along. And of course, to expand, to create new products, to find new markets means that we're using up more and more natural resources and contributing more and more to climate change. Now, if we can transition to a clean energy entirely, maybe this will be mitigated, but climate change is kind of far advanced already. Anyway, our current vice president, for the time being, for the next few days, Kamala Harris, she is, if she wants to be, she may be a front runner in the 2028 Democratic primaries. She would be the standard bearer for Bidenomics. What they neglected was anything for immediate help of ordinary workers. So nobody was feeling the advantages of this. This is going to come as these projects get rolled out and funded and things start building. Progressivism goes back to the time of the New Deal. Bernie Sanders was the big proponent of that in the last few elections. And then Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez may be a standard bearer for this. She's making more inroads in alliances within the Democratic Party. She's looked at as less of a bomb thrower, a little more of a team player. So she could be a vice presidential candidate or even a presidential candidate down the road. So they go back to this idea that the government should have a bigger role in the economy as it did in the New Deal. They want to bring health insurance into the public sector, the expansion of Medicare and its to more and more people. So reversing that thread of neoliberalism, more aid for individuals in the form of things like debt relief for students or tax credits for parents with children. They want to re-regulate key sectors like the financial sectors. Bernie is a hard critic of the deregulation of finances, and to raise taxes on the wealthy in order to reduce inequality and pay for some of these different programs of investment and subsidies and aid for individuals. They tried to form an alliance with Joe Biden early on, and then Biden's adoption of the agenda of AOC's Green New Deal, without calling it that, was trying to make a package out of these new investments that Biden promoted, as well as some help for ordinary people that Bernie Sanders was promoting and the progressives were promoting. But it turned out that that part of the package got taken out and separated from the investment package because of Democratic opposition from non-progressive Democrats, and eventually didn't pass. So the progressive side of it didn't pass. And I think that's why politically this failed, because there was not immediate aid for people that they could see. And in fact, they allowed a lot of these programs that had been instituted in the pandemic to expire. So people were seeing no benefits from Biden's program. They didn't understand it. They didn't see a benefit from it. And so they weren't able to make a very good case. Now, who are the economic conservatives? Nikki Haley, as I said, was the Republican primary to challenger to Donald Trump. And she espoused what is really a return to neoliberalism and all these classic conservative positions of reducing the role of the government in the economy. She is on board with the idea of cutting taxes. She wants deregulation of the economy, cutting social programs, privatizing public institutions, and reducing the national debt, something that I've never, to my memory, heard Donald Trump talk about. So it's more of a classic conservative position. She and a lot of Republicans and Democrats, usually called centrists, although they were conservatives a decade ago, they would all be considered on the right, not centrist. All these folks are still there. They still do not completely accept either Biden's program or Trump's program. The Republican business conservatives are kind of keeping their heads low and espousing loyalty to Trump, but I think all along. What they want is something closer to what Nikki Haley was selling. I'm not sure who will be their standard bearer next time around, but if J.D. Vance and Donald Trump are discredited in the eyes of voters, Nikki Haley may come back. So she kind of represents the past and perhaps the future as well on all that. So that is and with that program, it's been tried already back they've all been tried really at various points in time, but we live in a different economic environment. It's changed a lot since those times. Neoliberalism resulted in the big financial crash of 2008. So I don't think that that's going to win a lot of favor in the eyes of ordinary people, which means there could be other outcomes as well. Can't predict the future, a lot of contingencies, but I would say some other plausible outcomes are: number one, cascading environmental disasters like the wildfires currently and all the hurricanes and flooding that goes on could decimate the economy and just create a changed world that nobody can manage. Another one, and this is driven by the pursuit of profits, obviously, a lot of it, building houses in zones where they shouldn't, or contributing to climate change by continually using fossil fuels. So environmental catastrophe could throw everything off track politically and economically. Also, we could end up in a war or we could also see the decline of democracy even further if economics gets out of control and there's a lot of fear on the part of the wealthier elites that they cannot keep their advantages, and the popular support is moving towards restricting them and doing more for ordinary people. We could see just a clampdown on all democratic processes. We're already moving in that direction where your vote has less and less meaning. Therefore, a lot of what this show has been about is trying to advance democracy in favor of ordinary people and trying to clarify a possible path forward. And I do have ideas that are not any of those four, and that's what I've been trying to promote for years, but trying to find a platform for it has been hard. Anyway, we'll get into that in future shows. Thanks for watching. Comment below. I appreciate hearing from you. Like, share if you did like it. And I'll be seeing you in a couple of days, I think. Or at least you'll be seeing me. I'll be putting on another video to catch up on news, especially that involving efforts for independent candidates or third-party candidates to be able to challenge the two parties that seem to be dominated by these wealthy elites, as well as reforms in voting methods, which would also help them. All right, so that's what's coming up. Thanks. Bye-bye.